session because understanding this global propaganda threat, it's a new arena where the lines between the state and non-state actors get blurred. And accountability is a very difficult question. So thank you so much for raising such pertinent questions. We'll now directly move on to the next session, which is the Quad the future of global security architecture? Understanding India's Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'd like to invite Professor Harsh Pant on the stage. He's the moderator. Professor Harsh Pant, he's a professor in international relations in the Defence Studies Department and the India Institute at King's College London. He's the Director, Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He's also an adjunct fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in the US India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Washington, DC. So could you please join us?
Since the morning, and we now take a kind of a detour in areas where perhaps the title of this panel is Quad the future of global security architecture, understanding India's Indo-Pacific policies and strategy. So it's a very broad topic. We have 45 minutes. Sriparna has been very tough on all of us, which is good because we need to have lunch. I will request all the panelists to be sharp and brief in their response. Just very briefly contextualizing this, this panel and this topic. I think if you look at the debates on Indian foreign policy, on international relations more broadly, Indo-Pacific is a term that has sprung out of nowhere, and it now occupies such a central space that not a day passes where you don't hear something or the other which is impacting Indo-Pacific and how Indo-Pacific theatre is being channeled in various dimensions. We have seen important visits by Australian Prime Minister, Japanese Prime Minister to India, all of them talking about Indo-Pacific, all of them talking about Quad, and we have also seen, interestingly, the recent China-Russia joint statement also talking about Indo-Pacific. So here is a very interesting dichotomy. We were talking about Russia in the morning. There were some passionate back and forth on Russia, which I think we will continue to have. But it is very interesting that we are witnessing also a fault line emerging between India and Russia. On the Indo-Pacific, a fault line that appeared many years ago when Lavrov came to Delhi and berated India for joining Indo-Pacific and Quad. That fault line has moved forward, and I think much as we find it difficult to frontally tackle it in the public policy space, I think that's a question we all need to recognize and take forward. Where does India-Russia relations go from here? If at all, Indo-Pacific, which is so central to India's foreign policy vision, is not so central, or in fact is being seen as antagonistic to Russia's foreign policy posture. This is going to be fundamentally transformative for Indian foreign policy, for Indian security, and I think all those questions need to be addressed in some way, shape or form by the panelists themselves. And we have a very rich set of panelists today from various dimensions. We have Cleo, perhaps the Western look at Indo-Pacific, Quad, what do we make of it? We have Sriparna, which will perhaps give us the Indian perspective. We have Professor Kondapalli, who our foremost China expert, looking at it perhaps from China's vantage point, what it means for China and what it means for the Chinese opposition to Indo-Pacific, what it means for global politics, what it means for a number of issues that pertain to India. And finally, we have Admiral Chopra, who will give us the maritime dimension, what it means. Indo-Pacific ultimately is a maritime strategic geography. What it means, once again, for India, for India's maritime vision, and what place and what role Quad has in that security architecture. So I will start, Cleo, with you, and perhaps you can give us a Western or American or Canadian, whichever you want to look at it, engagement with the subject. Thank you.
Thanks. I have another presentation, but it's a lot shorter, because you're now all Pacific Island experts, so I can jump straight to the chase. Yeah, and I'm sorry I was late. I was talking to His Excellency the Ambassador from Morocco about Morocco's relationship with the Pacific Island countries, and how Morocco was also a historic maritime power. Is this okay? Is this better? Yeah. Okay. So, thank you very much. So, who knows who this fine gentleman in the middle of the photo is? That's the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, Manasseh Sogavari, with his new best friends from China. And I'm clearly coming from the West, but what this is actually about is currently the zone that the Quad is operating in is a political warfare zone, not a kinetic warfare zone, at least not at the moment. And the question is, how effective has the Quad been, or members of the Quad been, on the political warfare front? And it's going to be short. I'm going to look at one case study. I'm going to look at the Solomon Islands. The context for this is something that Colonel brought up yesterday, which is the Chinese unrestricted warfare approach. And he mentioned the three warfares, which are the most important. They're in this book, this 1999 book from two PLA Air Force colonels. They actually list 24 warfares, and you can see elements of them across the region, including things like, if anybody can have the presentation, by the way, very happy to share it, and you see it all over the region. What has that meant in the Solomon Islands? Solomon Islands is the perfect case study for understanding what China is trying to accomplish. They recognized Taiwan until 2019. In September 2019, the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, the man we saw in the first slide, unilaterally, without discussing it as an electoral campaign or anything, switched to China. So we have a starting point. Very unusual. We have a starting point from when the Chinese influence operations really started to come in. People in the country didn't like it. Women's groups didn't like it. Journalists didn't like it. They knew it was coming. And in particular, one entire province, Malaita Province, didn't want it. The government of Malaita Province, the provincial government supported by the traditional chiefs, 1 month later, put out the Auki communique, where they said they were putting a moratorium on any CCP-linked companies operating in the province. And one of the main reasons they did it was moral grounds. It says, they acknowledge freedom of religion as a fundamental right and further observes the entrenched Christian faith and belief in God by their peoples, and therefore rejects the Chinese Communist Party and its formal systems based on atheist ideology. There's a provincial government that said this. Everybody should know about this. They made a huge stand. We don't want the money. We think that this is going to destroy some of the core elements of our identity and our society, and we'll try to figure out another way. As a result, this is the premier of the province, Premier Sudani. He became enemy number one for both the central government and for the CCP. Tons of money went into trying to get him out, and he got sick. Unrelated, I'm sure. But he needed an MRI. And there was no MRI machine in the country. And the central government, the Sogavari's government, said, we're not going to pay for your treatment. The Australians said, and this is where the Quad thing comes in, this is a guy who stood up to China. What are the Australians going to do? They said, you need an MRI, that's fine, $100,000 up front. Honest politician doesn't have $100,000. Right? And so they said, central government said, we'll give you treatment and you accept China. And he said no. So if you want to see the face of a guy who's ready to die rather than take Chinese money, this is that face. Somebody here in India, Professor Nalapat, who I'm sure a lot of you may have heard about the situation. He happens to have a good relationship with President Tsai of Taiwan. He called the president's office, and President Tsai arranged for him to come to Taiwan for medical care. Where he got the medical care, but while he was away, in the meantime, China started pouring tons of money to co-opt the system. So they came in through Sogavari, about a dozen people. Then those dozen people started spreading the money throughout the system. They bought up, I've covered this in the Sunday Guardian extensively because the Indian press will write things that the US press won't. So we had the documents. These are the 39 of the 50 members of Solomon Islands Parliament who took money from the Chinese slush fund. That was enough to change the constitution, which they did, and they used it to postpone elections. So they were supposed to have elections this year in the Solomon Islands. They're not going to have them. Other local leaders have said this is going to lead to violence, that people hate this. And the normal narrative is that that's bad for China. I'll tell you why that's not bad for China. They did have violence. They had riots. What happened was peaceful demonstrators went to the parliament. They were fired on with tear gas. I think they were probably deliberately directed towards the Chinese commercial sector, where buildings were looted and burned. Okay, you're China. You're clever. Okay? What do you do at this point? What do you tell your proxies in Honiara, in the capital of Solomon Islands, to do? You ask them to invite in the Australians. And the Australians went in and propped up this very unpopular prime minister whose members of parliament were about to desert him. As a result, that prime minister can now turn to those MPs and say, I'm backed by China and I'm backed by Australia. Do you really want to go up against me? And since the Australians have gone in, that then justifies inviting in the Chinese. You can't have one and not the other. And that's where you get the Solomons-China Security Agreement, which allows, in this agreement, inviting in the PLA military to maintain social order, protect Chinese citizens in major projects. And then it was followed by those other two documents that I talked about for the region as a whole. Yeah, this is current. What about India? How important is India? This is the period where India is represented in Solomons by the High Commissioner based in Papua New Guinea. And he was trying to get in to do exactly the sort of things you're talking about. Talk to civil society, talk to everybody, because the Australians were saying we only deal with the government in power. They would not talk to the opposition. I know the opposition leaders, Penny Wong would go, they wouldn't talk to anybody. But India will. Democracy, democracy to democracy. So they were blocking his access until we ran the peace, and then finally they let him in. What happened after that was the money kept flowing to the opposition in Malaita, and in February they managed to engineer a vote of no confidence, and Daniel Suyudani was taken out as premier of Malaita. Okay. This is the ground war across the Indo-Pacific, actually across the world, but because we're talking about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific now. I'm going to tell you something that's not public yet. Premier Suyudani is in Fiji now, and he's applied for a visa to come to the US. He's been invited to an indigenous environmental conference for a UN-affiliated event. The US has denied his visa. Okay. This is a guy who'd rather die than take Chinese money. He's totally clean. He's on the front line of the ground war. The Australians didn't support him, and the US denied him a visa. So when you're talking about the Quad, and you're talking about what you're fighting for, you need to really think about what's going on at the ground level. The top level stuff is great, the vaccines, all that sort of stuff, but what's happening at the ground war? I think China's trying to accomplish this. I think they're waging this kind of entropic warfare. The goal is to win without fighting. The tactic is unrestricted warfare. And
and its contestation with other members in the region mean, in operational terms, and in almost tactical terms, and as you put it, at the level of the ground, where the contest is being fought day in and day out by countries, by nations, by leaders, and I think giving that case study is very helpful in terms of contextualizing the debate that we are having, which is about the security architecture in the region, what it means for preserving regional stability and of course prosperity. I will invite Professor Kondapalli now, if he wants to, if he can talk about China, and in particular as to how it looks at this development, not only the rise of the Indo-Pacific, but also the Quad, what are the views and how it is going about in pushing back against the narrative that there is, which is widely accepted. You have two major powers now, China and Russia, openly now saying that, look, the Indo-Pacific is nonsense, Quad will never work, and therefore what are the ideas behind that, and how do you see this getting operationalized for the Indian foreign policy?
Thank you, Harsh, and good afternoon to all of you. Let me thank the Usanas Foundation for the invite. First, the Indo-Pacific as such. So when President Trump organized this in Da Nang meeting in November 2017, they had about 6 items on the table, and let me just run all those 6. One is that there should be free and open Indo-Pacific. So that basically means that much of the sea lanes of communication should be open. It should not be restricted. So if you look at the Chinese approach, Vietnamese approach, and Malaysian approach, it was a territorial sea concept, not a high seas concept, which then means there is a problem about the free flow of goods and services. through that area. And this is very important for India because we have about 55% of our trade passing through the South China Sea, and there's no way you can let that happen. A territorial sea concept would mean all your ships have to go and take permission in order to enter, exit those areas. As you know, there was in 2009 there was the INS Airawat incident where Chinese called up the ship to go away from the South China Sea, and so we have had concerns on the territorial sea concept. Not so much with Vietnam and Malaysia, but still structurally, yes, it's a problematic. The second is rule of law, international law, and that is conditioned by the 2016 July Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling, where on 4 counts they have discounted the Chinese claims. One on the historical origins, historical claims. The Chinese argument is that during the Ming Dynasty, some of their ships went to these islands and they have placed some coins, they discovered some coins in these places, and so that should belong to that of China. By the way, please don't leave any coins in this room. So the concern is that historical claims cannot be part of the international legal claims. International law suggests to permanent and continuous occupation, physical and continuous occupation. That is the basis for international law to gain territories in the region. So China's claim has been quashed on that count, and they also mentioned about you cannot draw a 200 nautical mile from a reef, an artificial reef, and all of them are artificial reefs in the South China Sea, and so that was the second concern. The third is, of course, on the sea lanes of communications to be free. This is an international water, and so on and so forth. The fourth one is, of course, on the fishermen who have been in that area for centuries, specifically Filipino fishermen, and so their natural habitats and others have been disturbed, and so that also was criticized in the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling. The third is freedom of navigation and overflight, and that is also partly linked to the territorial sea and uninterrupted flow of goods and services in this region. And based on that, there were a number of ships that have been carried. But during Obama administration, they have stopped from going up to the 12 nautical mile, which is the international law in terms of the military sovereign zones, and so that proved to be a kind of concession for China despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling later on. So that became a norm for the Chinese, specifically south of Taiwan in Partial Channel and in other areas where they began to control the sea lanes of communications. The other three basically in this Da Nang meeting included maritime connectivity, maritime security, counter-terrorism, and WMD proliferation related matters. There is the North Korean WMD related issue that, for example, in Kandla, not far away from this area, the Indian Coast Guard captured a North Korean vessel which was carrying about 200 tons of material to Karachi, and these are used for the ballistic missiles and other parts. So, so these 6 points as part of the Indo-Pacific, and then later on we had the Quad. 4 meetings were held, 2 virtual, 2 physical, and as Dr. Paskal mentioned, there was the vaccination first. Second is in terms of the critical technologies, 5G, quantum computing, and others. And third, in terms of the maritime regions. So the focus is main on the maritime. So when President Biden asked Prime Minister Modi in the third virtual meeting, Prime Minister Modi on the Ukrainian issue, and Prime Minister Modi mentioned that Ukraine is continental while we are discussing about the maritime in the Quad. So there has been a distinction on that front on the maritime related matters. So where does all this figure out in terms of China and the title of our session is this global in nature. China is the largest trading partner for all of these countries in the Indo-Pacific, and of course across the board, 128 countries so far. And this is facilitated by the Henry Kissinger's policy in 1972, and subsequently by President Clinton with the MFN status and WTO. WTO joining meant China had a quantum jump in its relations. It used to have about $200 billion trade before it joined the WTO. And after joining WTO, last year, for example, about $3 to $4 trillion of exports and imports. That's the kind of impact WTO had provided. Mr. Ravi Solagate, many other discriminations. Indian pharmaceuticals cannot enter into China. There is a famous movie, a whaling movie, Opushri Aushan, which means basically, I'm not a god, a medical, one which has been sent from heaven. Basically, it suggests that the Indians produce a lot of generic drugs, but these are not in possession of the Chinese, and so there is a lot of smuggling of these from the Indian market. 180 million Chinese have liver troubles and cancer and other related problems. Yet the Chinese have stuck the borders, not allow any Indian pharmaceutical products to be entered. Secondly, no Indian software company have entered into the SOEs, state-owned enterprises in China. A lot of discrimination that way and non-tariff barriers. So the Chinese promised several things in the WTO, but they are not being implemented when it comes to the China market. So we lost about $1 trillion, $240 billion of surplus trade towards China in the last 11 years. Yet no mention about these things. European Union complains, US complains. Trump used some colorful language to explain the trade deficits with China. Still, China last year had $690 billion trade with the United States, out of which $540 billion is Chinese exports to the United States. Still, there is despite the tariff wars and others by the late Trump and early Biden, we did not see much change in this. So that is how China was able to create those surpluses, which then means a lot of pressure on all the Indo-Pacific countries to. Australia faced that problem when they opposed the Chinese in WHA meeting on the virus-related issues, origins of the virus. So what I was trying to say is China is putting a lot of pressure in terms of the trading partnerships with every other country. Dr. Paskal mentioned about the Solomon Islands and the Pacific, but main actors are, of course, in the Quad countries. All these four have been bearing the brunt on the trade front by not allowing any of these to enter into the China market. So that's one major consequence of the Chinese response. Second, of course, as Harsh mentioned, the March 21st joint statement between Putin and Xi Jinping mentions about the Asia-Pacific rather than Indo-Pacific. They said we oppose the small cliques that are being formed in international arena and various others. And they suggested to Mr. Lavrov mentioned about the global governance rather than the rule of law as part of the posturing by China and Russia in the future. This is taken from the Chinese terminology, the global governance, because China and Russia, of course, are part of the United Nations Security Council membership and have a lot of leverages as part of that. When you look at the veto power and look at the other mechanisms in the Security Council and General Assembly. So that is the second response that China has in terms of putting restrictions on any country which has even an element of difference of opinion with China on many fronts and including on the strategic issues. The third area where the Chinese are pushing hard is in terms of the military, which I would not like to at the moment speak because of the lack of time. That is another area where we see much in the maritime domain as well. Today, China has more naval ships than the United States. Trump once bragged about creating a 1,000 navy with the various countries, including India, but they were not able to couple up any one of those. So today, China has more naval ships than any of these Quad country related, and much of this technology actually flew from European Union, from South Korea, from Japan in the maritime domain. All the shipyard construction and all that came from all the big companies in the world have been put up in China, and they took all the technology, and now you have a big, in terms of deadweight tonnage build up, China is number one. They have 7 out of the 10 major ports in the world handling capacity, and of course in other domains. They now have, instead of the comprehensive national power, they have the comprehensive maritime power, because the Chinese know that that's where the global prosperity is lying, and so that's where the thrust areas are. In terms of the title that we have today, is this going to be a global, the Indo-Pacific or the Quad? Technically, structurally, this is meant for this pan-regional Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. So to that extent, it is not global, it is pan-regional at this point of time. And for that, for this to grow, to become a global, it has to have an institutional mechanism, it has to have a headquarters, it has to have various other hang-ups that we generally see with those global organizations. So let me stop here by saying that it is not yet global in nature. Thank you.
Thanks. I think in laying out Chinese objections and in laying out Chinese response to this idea of whether Indo-Pacific and then its extrapolation into Quad, you have laid out several markers there, and I think what is interesting is I think Ambassador Puri was mentioning in her, during her panel this idea of unilaterals and plurilaterals that we are generating. So perhaps this Quad is also a reflection of this sense of frustration with the multilateral order, that it is not working. So what do we do? Can like-minded?
It's been before that, because the rise of China has been challenging the international system, and it challenges the international system because China seeks to establish its version of the international system, which is far away from the rule-based order which democracies of the world currently promote. The Indo-Pacific, which was formerly known as the Asia-Pacific, which Professor Pant and Professor Kondapalli also mentioned, it's emerged as a region with multiple flashpoints, most of which are centered around China. The concept of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic space gained momentum, and India embraced it in this keynote speech by Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018. The US renamed its Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command in the same year. The US, which may or may not be to China's liking, still remains the leading power in the international system owing to its military and economic prowess. For decades referred to this vast stretch of territory between Australia and India as the Asia-Pacific, but this strategic lexicon shifted under Donald Trump. Despite the change in leadership in the US and the Biden administration coming in, the term continues to exist, and the administration defines the region as the Indo-Pacific, which is in line with the US foreign policy in response to China's growing influence. The repeated reference to Indo-Pacific, a policy frame promoted by the Trump administration, reflects the Biden administration's continued outreach to the region and the way that the US foreign policy has been recast by China's expanding influence. Japan was an early proponent of the concept, with the late Shinzo Abe having spoken of the great confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans in an address to the Indian Parliament in 2007. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, he visited India a few days ago, and he announced a new Indo-Pacific plan during his visit. Australia has adopted the term in its official discourse as well. China initially dismissed the concept as an attention-grabbing idea, something which would dissipate like the ocean foam, but then it has been issuing statements to countries like South Korea and Bangladesh that they should not be joining the Quad. So clear divergences between what they said in the past and what they say now. With regards to the vast oceans of the Indo-Pacific, India has emphasized the principle of freedom of navigation and respect for the laws of the sea, which finds resonance with the central ideas of the Quad. The importance of the freedom of navigation was reiterated last year in 2022 by our Defence Minister Rajnath Singh, as he stated that India stands for a free and rules-based Indo-Pacific, which is crucial for the economic development of the region and wider global community. He added that dialogue is the only civilized mechanism for resolving disputes and creating a global order. Now, India does not believe in a world order where few are considered superior to the others, and a multi-aligned policy is the only way to share prosperity. China has called the Quad the Asian NATO, continues giving out vitriolic statements against the group. The Quad is not a formal military alliance. Countering China's hegemonic aspirations is a theme for cooperation, but there are a lot of other themes as well. The central question here is how well does the Quad, as the future of the global security architecture, fit in with India's Indo-Pacific strategy? So for this purpose, it becomes pertinent to look at the latest joint statement from the Quad leaders, post the Quad leaders Tokyo summit last year. As you know, Professor Kondapalli also mentioned, when this meeting happened last year, it was the second in-person meet. It was a time of profound global challenges. There was a need to actually showcase that the Quad is a force for good, committed to bringing tangible benefits, etc. The statement reads, and I quote, "With the COVID-19 pandemic still inflicting human and economic pain around the world, tendencies for unilateral actions among states and a tragic conflict raging in Ukraine, we are steadfast. We strongly support the principles of freedom, rule of law, democratic values, sovereignty and territorial integrity, peaceful settlement of disputes, without resorting to the threat or use of force, any unilateral attempt to change the status quo, and freedom of navigation and overflight, all of which are essential to the peace, stability and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region and to the world." This is the statement. Despite this, China fears that the sole purpose of the Quad is to counter it. And as is clear from this joint statement, belligerent actions, be it from any state, it will get called out because the necessity for the existing world order is peace. So the Russia-Ukraine war, even without direct mention of Russia, finds a space in this statement. Democratic values are mentioned, sovereignty and territorial integrity are mentioned, along with the freedom of navigation amongst others. Now, India's foreign policy has always emphasized the respect for sovereignty, peace and democratic values. In fact, Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, which is a directive principle of state policy, directs the state to promote international peace and security and maintain just and honorable relations between nations. It further directs the state to respect international law and treaty obligations and to settle disputes peacefully. All of these themes in the Quad are directly in line with India's aspirations for a peaceful world order. The joint statement gets divided into further subsections which I titled Peace and Security, COVID-19, Global Health Security, Infrastructure, Climate, Cyber Security, Critical and Emerging Technologies, Quad Fellowship, etc. Now, in order to find out how closely are these themes related to India's foreign policy goals, I've picked and chosen a few of these themes due to paucity of time because I've been chasing after everyone to wind up on time. So I've just picked up just a few of these themes. The first theme is that of peace and stability. We all know the war rages on in Ukraine, and as the war has raged on, even partners and friends of India in the international system have viewed India's abstentions at the UN on resolutions around Russia with suspicion. But the fact is that India on multiple occasions has emphasized the need for peace. I think Dr. Seth had mentioned in the morning that silence is also a certain way, that's also a behavior which needs to be interpreted, and that's also promoting peace. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his telephone calls has reiterated to Putin multiple times the necessity for peace and for negotiations. In the recent G20 Foreign Ministers Summit, which was held in New Delhi, Russia and China were the two countries which did not support a joint communique. The communique had stated the need for peace and stability, and the urgent need for an end to the war in Ukraine, India issued the chairperson's summary naming Russia and China for not joining the consensus on Ukraine from the Bali document. The war in Ukraine has raised difficult questions in New Delhi about the implications of this deepening Russia-China alliance. The No Limits partnership of last year preceded the war, and it's only this war has solidified Russia-China ties, and it's brought into stark relief and outcome Delhi has been actively working to bypass the fallouts of. India understands the perils of the lack of stability and peace. Now, what is really weird is that if there are suspicions between India and its Quad partners or India and its allies in the West, cooperation becomes difficult, and China uses deception to further this wedge, which may or may not exist. An example is from Wang Yi's visit last year, and the directive from China was that we should keep it as a very hush-hush affair. So now, what's the signaling over here? If all of a sudden I go and talk to Dr. Paskal in a very hush-hush manner, and I go and whisper in her ear, the signal which goes out is that we have a closer bond homie than, say, between me and Professor Kondapalli or Professor Pant, or between some. So, that's the signaling which goes out. We, of course, didn't give Wang Yi the red carpet welcome, which we generally do, and but the thing, there was a clear deception which China wanted to use, which is why it asked for a hush sort of thing. But I think, as Aditya had mentioned in the morning, journalists don't listen, especially Indian journalists, so it got out in the media in any case. So China will try and use deception in trying to signal that India's goals are different from those of other democratic countries. Coming to the next goal, which was mentioned in the joint statement, something great yet funny happened a few days ago as the WHO called out China for hiding data from the COVID-19 crisis. Should have happened much earlier, but nevertheless happened. In the realm of COVID and global health security, it's pertinent to mention India's vaccine Maitri. I think Dr. Seth had also mentioned it in the morning. It's a humanitarian initiative, and as of February 2022, India delivered 162.9 million doses of vaccines to 96 countries. This is in complete juxtaposition to what China has done. Of these, 14.3 million doses were gifted to 98 countries, while the remaining were supplied by vaccine providers under commercial obligations. Well, we also got more than 200 crore doses of COVID vaccination and reached a 90% vaccination rate. It's a demonstration of the kind of action that can be taken to control the pandemic. Public health crisis is something which affects the globe. India is the most populated country in the world. This is definitely something India would want to collaborate on. Then coming to the realm of climate change, at the COP27, India submitted its long-term low-emission development strategy, LTLETs, to the UNFCCC, included the plan for rapid expansion of green hydrogen production, threefold increase in nuclear capacity by 2032, 20% of ethanol blending in petrol by 2025, and more. Last year, India took on the mantle of the G20 leadership, and the leadership slogan is One Earth, One Family, One Future, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And this action very aptly underlines how inextricably humanity is linked, and it's definitely linked in suffering and addressing the effects of climate change. Again, goals are aligned over here. In the realm of cybersecurity, this is one of the last points that I picked up from the joint statement. Cybersecurity is a very interesting domain, and it's a new domain. Warfare is unfolding here also. As far as cybersecurity is concerned, the National Investigation Agency was given the mandate to take up cases of cyber terrorism. We also had a national conference on cybersecurity and national security called Cyber Aparadh Se Azadi, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which was held in New Delhi and was organized by the MHA. What's interesting here, some of the developments which happened in the realm of cybersecurity last year. There was a ransomware attack on the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. All processes had to go manual. It took 2 weeks to get the infected systems online again. The probe into the cyber attack on some servers at AIIMS found that the IP addresses of 2 emails, which were identified from the headers of the files, were encrypted by hackers originating from Hong Kong. And besides this, multiple fake Chinese apps have engaged in financial fraud in India. They offer low-interest loans. In January this year, there was a fraud of 300 crore rupees through 15, just 15 fake Chinese applications. They engaged in a crore of 300 crores. The Uttarakhand police busted this syndicate of cyber criminals, and callers were offering low-interest loan rates. These cyber thugs also based in China blackmail victims because now they have remote access to their phones. So this is a realm which is important to us. So in conclusion, as I tried portraying in all these realms, there is a bonhomie between India and Quad countries as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. India has had security concerns. It's pertinent to find joint solutions to these newly emerging security threatening arenas. India's national interests and foreign policy goals are in line with the realms of cooperation identified by the Quad Statement of 2022. So Quad and India mutually need each other, and we need to avoid these sorts of suspicion which might emerge from the deception which might be carried on by China, because most of the threats which emerge in the Indo-Pacific, sadly enough, emanate from China. So thank you so much for patiently listening to me.
And I think China, to a certain extent, has been the main driver, not only pushing Indo-Pacific towards a logical conclusion, but also giving rise towards a more robust operationalization of the Quad. So when we look at the drivers and the factors and what is causing what, it's very interesting that you have to put China in the very heart of it. If it were not for China, then we would not be having this conversation. And if it were not for particular behavior of China, we would not be having a lot of these conversations. So it's I think, very, very interesting phenomena that much as China wants to push it back, the way it has approached some of these questions has almost taken these conversations, taken these ideas and just plombed them at the center stage of global politics. And since Sriparna talked about maritime and a lot of this argument, Indo-Pacific being a maritime zone, let me invite Admiral Chopra now for his views on how he views this topic.
Thank you. May I just go across there? Okay, a very good afternoon to all of you. Delighted to be here, and many thanks to the organizers for calling me. Before I get down to the maritime and strategic aspects which I've been asked to speak on, I thought I might talk a little bit about the title, which I also found a bit intriguing, and which was mentioned by the other speakers. Global Security Architecture and Quad seemed a bit odd to me. It is clearly a regional sort of construct, and why are we even talking about it in terms of global security? So I could think of two reasons. One is that if it is successful as a regional construct, then perhaps it could be replicated elsewhere, perhaps in Eastern Europe or Central Asia. But the more interesting possibility, I think, is that if it is, say, templated on a very different quadrilateral after the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe in 1815, where four different countries, the UK, Prussia, Austria and Russia, actually created a quadrilateral to contain France and to balance each other, perhaps. I don't think we are there yet, because this particular quadrilateral, unless it includes China somewhere in the near future or far future, can be a balance of power arrangement, but it can certainly be a containing sort of place or construct. The point which comes out is that history has shown us that security architectures are most successful when they are controlled by smaller groups of nations and not very, whose memberships are not very large. The United Nations, ASEAN, EU have clear problems of consensus and decision making, whereas RIC, SCO, Quad, etc. are finding it easier to get to what they want to do. So therefore, perhaps Quad will morph into a template which could perhaps be global in nature, where smaller countries, smaller but major powers, try and make a security architecture which pertains to all. So I put this to you, and maybe I put a cat amongst the pigeons, that these security architectures are best handled by smaller groupings. But that by its very nature is exclusive and quite against the narrative of inclusivity which is present today. Anyway, having said that, let me get on to the Quad Indo-Pacific in maritime terms. The Quad always was about India, China and maritime, whatever everyone says about it. And it was based not only on China's assertiveness, but the China's vulnerability and dependence on the same ocean that Japan and to a certain degree other powers are dependent on. That is the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean not just being a trade highway, but also an investment destination and a strategic destination, which gave opportunity to many powers to fish in these waters. So, in due course, India being the only power from Suez to Malacca with the size, the area, the population, the military, the economy, and the location to be able to balance China was drawn into the Quad, and the Asia-Pacific became the India-Pacific. Now this is not a bad thing because the China threat is real, and we should not have any wishful thinking about China. It is to imagine a conspiracy that there is conflict being created by India and China by other powers is dangerous and delusional. Civilizationally, the Middle Kingdom does not tolerate peer competitors, and it demands suzerainty in its local neighborhood. So to think of a pan-Asian sort of, tie-up between Asian powers is, in my opinion, wishful thinking. We should get clear-headed about China, which most of us are, but you do keep hearing that we could do it otherwise. As far as Quad is concerned, we all know that in 2007, not only Australia, but India was not too keen to make it seen as an anti-China alliance, or to be seen as containing China even. But all that changed in 2017 in Quad 2.0 when President Trump and Premiers Modi and Abe in his second term fashioned a more aggressive alliance. But between 2017 and COVID and a new change in the United States, what Quad has become is morphed into a all-singing, all-dancing, all-embracing sort of convergence of democracies, which is fine, and I think it serves the purpose because despite the lack of focus on the military, much military action is taking place between these four countries, foundational agreements not only between US and India, but between Japan and India, Australia and India, many multiple exercises, increasing in scope, complexity, and regularity. And I put it to you that nowadays, in today's world, you don't need military alliances to do something which is really tangible as a military man, and that is targeting information. We have seen in Ukraine that what the United States and the Western powers, and even Elon Musk has provided is targeting information. And if I can get targeting information outside a military alliance, that is perfectly fine with me. So the Quad will continue to morph, but the very fact that these countries have gathered together is a deterrent because of the possibility and potentialities which exist in this setup. And I don't think China has any doubt about that. And I think what the Quad has done in recent times is downplay the military aspects, but the military aspects, ladies and gentlemen, remain very much there, not just beneath the surface, but quite on the surface, and much is happening on that front. The Indo-Pacific, which cannot be divorced from the Quad, they were born at the same time, and now despite different perceptions, everyone agrees it's from the east coast of Africa to Oceania, as discussed today. And increasingly, it's not a maritime construct, even though as a naval officer I say that. Increasingly, it is including the continental dimension. And with China and Russia's Eurasian sort of play, Mackinder's original thesis about continent versus maritime comes into play. I see the Indo-Pacific now, and many others perhaps see it as one large strategic sphere with multiple flashpoints, any of which could be pressed not only by Quad but by China, and you have to see where you can apply the pressure. These include the East China Sea, the Sea of Japan, the Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, the Himalayan frontier, Western Central Asia. All this is one strategic geographical entity which is still regional in the sense it doesn't encompass the whole globe, but it is there for everyone to put pressure on both sides as required. In the Western Pacific, undoubtedly China is now, or maybe arguably, the dominant military power. They have achieved much of their anti-access and A to AD doctrine. It's no longer easy for American forces to operate with impunity in the Western Pacific. That part China is dominant. But one thing I want to bring out clearly today is outside the Western Pacific, China is vulnerable and weak. Despite that large navy, it's weak because of geography, it's weak because of lack of allies, lack of bases, and lack of combat experience in the couple of centuries which we have lived through. China is vulnerable, but China realizes this. And China also realizes that if it is to move to real great power status, then it must have offensive capability in all oceans, like the Soviet Union. You can't be a great power just with satellite and cyber. You can't be a great power just with air power. Eventually you have to have offensive capability in all the oceans of the world. The ocean is one. We have divided it into 7, Pacific, Atlantic, etc. But if you're on any one point on the earth, on water, you're connected to all other points in water. And a maritime conflict cannot be restricted to one little area, like a particular sector, say in the border or in the army. Because if there's a firefight somewhere in the South China Sea, nothing stops American forces from destroying Chinese shipping in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean. The Chinese know this, and they know that the Indian Ocean is the step, should I say, towards the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. There's no way they can lead the Mediterranean and the Atlantic from the Pacific. The Pacific is basically in the US-China strategic balance, but everywhere else the Chinese need the Indian Ocean to be able to exude power, maritime power, elsewhere on the oceans of this earth. And as someone brought out, this whole business of Taiwan is actually the need to break the second island chain. Taiwan by itself is not critical in any way, in any major way, except the emotionalism of war. But if you get hold of Taiwan, whichever way, and you manage to keep Oceania under control, then you have become a Pacific power in the actual sense. In the Indian Ocean, however, it's more difficult, because when we talk of the Indo-Pacific in one phrase, the connect between the two oceans is very limited. Just a couple of straits through Indonesia. They are not very well connected oceans. And the thing about the Indian Ocean is, once you get in, it's difficult to get out. And once you get out, it's difficult to get in. Geography is destiny in actual terms. And it's all very well in peacetime. I must make this very clear. It's easy for Chinese ships and warships to enter the Indian Ocean in peacetime and exit the Indian Ocean in peacetime. But it's a different ballgame under combat conditions or under conflict conditions, which most people tend to forget. They view the entire strategic, should I say, occurrences through this prism of what we have today as somewhat grey peace all over the world. But as a military man, should it actually become a conflict, then it's not easy for Chinese warships to enter the Indian Ocean. And should they be there, they are stuck there and prone to interdiction and other aspects. So I just want to say that China is vulnerable in the Indian Ocean. At the same time, it's hugely dependent on the Indian Ocean because of not only oil, but because of markets, investments, etc. We must take advantage, and I'm here speaking as India, of this compulsive vulnerability. It's a vulnerability they can't get rid of. because it's compulsion. Their presence in the Indian Ocean is something they can't do without. And when they are in, they are vulnerable. And I and some people would go far as to say that we can moderate Chinese behavior in the northern latitudes by suitable policies in our oceans. It requires a little more focus, but it can be done. The Chinese know it, we know it. It's a question of capacity and capability. It's a question of budgets and defense industrial base. We'll get there, I think, but whoever bet on India in the Indo-Pacific is possibly bet correctly, because there is no other country in this entire arc from Suez to Malacca which can provide the stability which translates into net security provider and Sagar and everything else. There's nobody else. Tell me one country who can do this. And it was recognized long ago, not only by the Western powers, but by Japan. And today what you're seeing is that, but we have certain vulnerabilities that people haven't thought about when they speak at this always, during peacetime seminars, should I say. We talk about Andaman and Nicobar, how it can interdict Chinese shipping, but Andaman and Nicobar is vulnerable to Chinese attack. Air attack, missile attack, the moment the conflict goes up. We should be paying much more attention to the defense of Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which is our foremost frontier outpost. I personally am not completely satisfied with how we have progressed in that regard, but the effort is on. The second thing which most people don't recognize is peninsular India is vulnerable to Chinese warships and submarines. You don't require Pakistani aircraft to break airspace, fly across India to target Bangalore and Hyderabad. It can be done from the sea, from 400 miles, 500 miles out to sea. You can pinpoint the workshop of a defense firm in Bangalore from no man's land without breaking any international law. And I think this particular thing, I keep saying it, but again, because we tend to look at this whole equation in peacetime terms, we don't give it enough thought. Next time, should there be hot conflict? And most people, I think, have also made up their mind that there will not be hot conflict, despite what they say in Ukraine. Some of us keep trying to say a hot conflict in the Indo-Pacific is very much a possibility unless we take the deterrent steps that we need to, which has been talked about a lot. I'll take just 1-2 minutes to say India's IP strategy, because it was in the heading, is multi-pronged. It doesn't depend only on the Quad. Quad is one element of India's Indo-Pacific strategy. There are a heap of bilaterals and trilaterals amongst Quad members and elsewhere. We also have a very strong relationship with France, which is an Indian Ocean power, with whom we have progressed as far as the strategic outlook is concerned. We are now even got advisory interest in the combined maritime forces, which have been there across in Oman and Western Indian Ocean. We are into a lot of focus on West Asia. I think Ambassador Tignan will tell us something more. Oman, Dukum, I2U2, and also similarly in the Indian Ocean island nations, including a Sri Lanka maritime, Maldives, India maritime cooperation and exercises. And last but not least, but I must say it, the Navy, very expensive service. Only strong and economically rich nations can afford navies of any consequence. You can't have a strong navy unless you're an economic power. We are getting there. The navy is strong, it's three-dimensional, it operates aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines. It has many bases in peninsular India. It is a force to reckon with, but we need continuous funding, which again, military men like me are not particularly satisfied with, but not because we want an unending stream of money, but because that money can be better applied. And I come to the defense industrial base, which we all talk about, and which we all focus on. You know, we talk about it and then we talk about MSME. MSMEs. Till we get large private companies as integrators and prime contractors, nothing is going to change, in my opinion, in the country. Because you need integrators. Integrate, Northrop, Boeing, etc. are companies which do R&D, design. Manufacturing is not important. It can be given to 100 people. The Tatas are making wings for Boeing. It's all about research and development, integrating, designing, and then integrating the product. And that cannot happen unless we get our private large companies into it. We've tried many things. We've tried strategic, partnerships. But it hasn't worked because somewhere along the way, successive governments seem to lose focus on this fact that private industry is not going to bite unless you assure them of either orders or you subsidize their research and development in the first place. If you don't, you will be left in the situation where we are, and that is something which is not the best of things. Anyway, so we must work on our defense industry big. We must exploit Chinese vulnerability. And last but not least, we tend to forget in environments like this, that the world order, old or new, is essentially anarchic. If you think our world is complicated, think of the world when the Mongol invasions were taking place, or the Huns and the Goths were, rushing into Rome and the Roman Empire. Every age has its own issues. The world order is anarchic. Beneath the veneer of human civilization, might unfortunately still remains right. We all try and make sure that we don't get into that situation where might is applied, and we are doing a pretty good job. But till we deter might taking force into its own hands, it's not the same thing. And of course, and this is with respect to some of the discussions that took place, we all quote Palmerston and say that there are no permanent friends and enemies, but only permanent interests. But we seem to be getting bogged down with emotionalism and friendships, which may or may not, or enmities, which may or may not be what we really require. I think a dispassionate, emotionless approach is the best that can be done for India in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your patience. It's not easy being the last speaker before lunch, but I also think people are resigned to listening to him, so it's better than the last, should I say, round before lunch. Thank you.